So this is part 2 of the KhoodeelaarTV campaign, World Exclusive Diagnosis of Fleet Street. Now this is part 2, and we're looking at the rest of the Financial Times. And the Financial Times has got a couple of pieces in short on the front page. One is about ever closer workplace surveillance is bad for our health. There's an opinion on page 23, which is about spying on employees. And there is an editorial about free speech. And a comment piece by Gideon Rahman. Rahman is spelled R-A-C-H-M-A-N, as opposed to the ordinary spelling of the Rahman with R-A-H-M-A-N, Rahman. So Gideon Rahman is not a Muslim name. And the piece is about Europe is not immune from US-style unrest. Now, this headline is typically shielding the trumped America and the racist kind of power framework in the USA by, say, unrest. If black people did anything similar to that riot, Capitol taking over, it would not be called unrest. It would be called something far worse, far more worrying. And unrest is an understatement. And this last paragraph is completely dishonest as well. The rule that what starts in America eventually ends up in Europe is not confined to popular culture and technology. It can also apply in politics. There is no such thing as a rule. There's a complete lie. And there are scattered contradictory pieces on the Financial Times about other things, but this first editorial is about free speech, and so what cannot be overlooked either is the responsibility of conventional television outlets such as Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, which has enabled Mr. Trump for too long, and according to one study, has been more influential in spreading false beliefs than social media. The UK, which has given approval for a Murdoch-owned opinionated news channel, should pay careful heed. Now, these are complacent pieces. Both the one by Gideon Rahman and the first editorial about the limits on free speech in the internet era. And I think this piece is also quite seductive in that the headline gives the false impression that it is against spying on employees. And it says that workplace surveillance, it doesn't say spying, but it says surveillance, should be subject to regulatory oversight and ideally collective bargaining, since individuals will be better placed to negotiate the details en masse. It would be a dispiriting irony if technology brought in to protect our health in a pandemic made us sicker in the end. Now, again, this is a superficial kind of complacent piece. Using the really serious issues, but registering only tokenistic concerns about those issues. And that is probably the diagnostic summary of today's Financial Times, which is being dishonest, as we have said, on the evidence, on the contents. And let's see if the Guardian has got a piece by Polito and B about the likelihood of Johnson calling a snap election, which she posted online between 16 and 1700 hours on Monday, that is yesterday, 11th of January. Let's see where his bike ride took him to. We haven't found the piece on the snap election by Polito and B yet. We shall be looking at the Guardian in detail and search for it. And the questions of our Stratford bike ride said, piece by Jessica Murray and Jessica Algott. Boris Johnson is under pressure to clarify details of a Sunday bike ride 7 miles from Downing Street residence after number 10 refused to say whether he was driven there. Now, park goers spotted Johnson cycling in the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in Stratford, East London, along with his security detail on Sunday. A Downing Street source said the Prime Minister was exercising within the rules, but would not give further details as to whether Johnson cycled or was driven there. The Prime Minister follows COVID secure guidelines. It does not say in the regulations that driving somewhere to take exercise is a breach of the rules. That is not a comment on the Prime Minister's case, but the rules only say remain local, the source said. Government COVID guidelines says you should not travel outside your local area while exercising. Johnson's spokesman was unable to provide any information on the record, but a number 10 source said there was no suggestion his travel had broken any rules without giving details. Now, how completely cowardly and stupid is the Guardian? It is referring to two things. One is Johnson's source or spokesman, and then Downing Street, number 10 Downing Street source. What kind of idiots are responsible for this kind of stupid piece? Peddling Johnson. Labour MP Andy Slaughter said, once again, it is do as I say, not as I do, from the Prime Minister. London has some of the highest infection rates in the country. Boris Johnson should be leading by example. Asked at yesterday's press conference whether traveling 7 miles for a cycle ride was within the rules, the Health Secretary Hancock said, if you went for a long walk and ended up 7 miles from home, that is okay, but you should stay local. News of the bike ride emerged in the Evening Standard days after two women, Jessica Allen and Eliza Moore, were fined £200 by police for driving 5 miles to meet for a walk. Yesterday, the fines were rescinded. The Chief Constable of Derbyshire Police, Rachel Swan, said the two fixed penalty notices have been withdrawn and we have notified the women directly, apologizing for any concern caused. Allen said, we have received an apology. We welcome this apology and we are pleased to draw a line under this event. Now, this is absolutely pathetic, stupid, non-journalism and covering up by The Guardian. The two things should not have been confounded in this way. Johnson's breach should have been linked to Dominic Cummings and Johnson's father, Johnson's other relations doing the breaching, and Johnson himself breaching the rules before. And it should have been connected to the sacking or the enforced resignation of one of the COVID-19 advisors from one of the universities. And there is a piece about this one. Black Lives Matter UK will be dispersing more than £100,000 to black-led organizations in Britain this month, as activists pledged to build on last year's anti-racism protests. Natasha, a co-founder of All Black Lives Matter, expects the year ahead to be a crucial one for anti-racist activists. 2020 was just the foundation for what's going to happen now, she said. Now, whether Natasha is Natasha Shivanandan or another Natasha, they don't say, but that is, and the headline is Black Lives Matter, UK to fund groups and campaigns from £1.2 million in donations. Now, I don't believe that this will be correctly used to oppose racism. The Black Lives Matter has not been opposing racism anywhere near as honestly, as effectively, and as rigorously as it should have been, or as racism should have been opposed, and Black Lives Matter be expanded into including and representing all the victims of racism, and especially expressly including the communities known as African and Asian. And as I have been saying in the last broadcasts, not this today's one, but in the last 2 days, there has been no organized opposition to racism. The platform to oppose racism, a platform made up of and consisting of the African and Asian background people. And the reason why that is not happening and that has not happened is not unconnected with the operation of the racist agenda. It is easy to say divide and rule, but this actually is one example of how racists have continuously divided the African and Asian people against one another, and they're stooges and brainwashed agents inside those two communities or two kind of groups of the population, have also been very actively engaged in discouraging the emergence or establishment of the united front and platform containing people from African and Asian backgrounds opposing racism. But that again is also a result of the fact that within the people of African origin and people of Asian origins and backgrounds, there are divisions, untenable divisions, and they have been there for decades. And my involvement in trying to work towards creating a platform over the last 50 years, let's say, in Britain, this actually is worth going through and going over and examining in terms of any kind of lasting lessons that can be found in the fact that I have universally applied my resources and energies and abilities and skills to creating such a platform. And I have been finding that there is no equivalent, responsive, cooperative action from anyone from the African or Asian community. And this is something that is worth actually looking at in detail, which I shall be doing in the context of talking about the Black Lives Matter and this item in today's Guardian, that is the Guardian of Tuesday, the 12th of January 2021, that the people who are involved in the Black Lives Matter in the UK have declared that the donation they received of 1.2 million, of that donation they will give 100,000 pounds to anti-racist campaigns. Now, anti-racist campaigns in this country have been on the record. I mean, that phrase has been on the record, but the action has not been. What there have been can be summarized as sporadic and discontinuous and inconsistent and incomplete one-off events and activities. For example, the various things that happened in the aftermath of Altavali's murder by racists in 1978 in Tower Hamlets. And similar kind of activities that followed the racist murder of the child in Newham in East London, Kenneth Singh, and the racist attacks and murder in Southall, murders in Southall, including the murder of a Tower Hamlets school teacher of New Zealand, from New Zealand, Blair Peach, in 1979. These are events that cannot be categorized as permanent platforms or activities. And the reason is that there have been racists actively opposing and sabotaging the anti-racist activities from becoming permanent activities and platforms. So, for example, the attack by a woman of Jamaican or Caribbean background on a Bangladeshi woman, Muslim woman, wearing hijab, that is symptomatic of the depth of ignorance and stupidity on the part of the ignorant members of the African community towards the Asian community. And the vice versa can be found. Not necessarily in the similar physical attacks, but in terms of the denial of the rights of the African origin people, in terms of the attitude and the outlook and the perception. So who will decide who the 100,000 pounds will go to is also important. And before going into any further details about that, 100,000 pounds is a very small amount of money that the campaign against racism needs. The campaign against racism needs millions of pounds, or the equivalent of millions of pounds, hundreds of millions of pounds. And the campaigns and the movement that I have been organizing and operating and running and representing have been worth billions of pounds worth of resources. I have organized all of that, and I have done that by devoting my entire energy and resource to these opposition to racism and to the diagnosis of society in the racist context. And I have found that there is no shortage of evidence of racism, but there is a serious shortage and lack of people being prepared to undertake tasks that are significant and substantial and consistent with the needs of the society, needs of the people affected by racist violations. And in this context, it is important to point out the concept of diversity. Diversity was launched by Theresa May in 2017, and the diversity was a complete, absolute, routine racist event. She invited to number 10 Downing Street a series of stooges, black-skinned stooges, who didn't contribute anything original about the falsity and the artificiality and the racism of the Theresa May regime. And so therefore, when the Slough MP, Labour MP, Tanman Desi tweets typical, topical kind of items apparently against racism, he does so to go through the motion, to actually put himself on the record as being concerned against racism. And he doesn't do anything that is really taking the fight against racism to anywhere near the point of using Parliament and his platform in Parliament to oppose racism. And this applies to other Labour Party members who are of Asian or African origin. Let's say the majority, I think, in the Labour Party who can be called Asian background and Asian origin are all of them quite openly against racism, but they're not anywhere near adequately and rigorously against racism. Now that's the difference. For example, when the Labour Party launched the racist, opportunistic black sections in the 1980s, featuring Diane Abbott as the wearer of the jumper, bearing the words black section, and Paul Bertang and Keith Vaz and Barney Grant. The Labour Party did that as a racist tactic to contain the genuine urges to oppose racism in the Labour Party and also to use the potential votes for candidates for the Labour Party, which is what they did. They got Keith Sleesvaz elected in Leicester, Diana Abbott elected in Hackney, Barney Grant elected in Tottenham, in the borough of Haringe, and Paul Botang elected in Brent, London. All four of them from London constituencies. And the sum total of opposition to racism by all four of them is a small sum indeed. Barney Grant made very personal comments about him being treated with open, insulting attitude by white persons in the Palace of Westminster. And he joined the campaign calling for reparations for the slavery by the British to the African people. Apart from that, Barney Grant didn't actually address racism. He did speak about racism, but he didn't address racism as he should be on the evidence. And there was a clear reluctance on the part of Barney Grant to identify in the opposition to racism together with the African and Asian people together. He never made that. It's a matter of record, it's a matter of fact. And yet Barney Grant is feted and celebrated as the champion of opposition to racism. Now that claim has to be examined. And on examination, that claim will be found to be not substantiated. Of course, he did speak against racism. What else could he do? But the point is not about speaking against racism, but actually solidarizing with the people in a permanent, in a lasting way, opposing racism. And there is no institution, there is no analysis that can be found to have been created by Barney Grant. And today, years after Barney Grant's death, the current MP, David Lammy, who is the replacement for Barney Grant from the same constituency, is not anywhere near as rigorous and as truthful, as honest, as consistent against racism as he should be. And Diana Abbott and Sleesvaz and Paul Botang can be factually, evidentially, totally rejected as having made any contribution against racism in this country as members of parliament. The ones that are currently members of parliament carrying the Labour Party's card or banner are not speaking anywhere near as rigorously, as effectively, as truthfully, as comprehensively against racism at any level whatsoever. And so therefore, on a parliamentary level, there is no racism, kind of opposition to racism by the elected members of parliament from the Labour Party. And there is no elected member with the Conservative Party who has got a background either as an Asian or an African. No opposition to racism by any of them whatsoever. In the House of Peers, Saeeda Warsi, who is a occasional, periodic utterer of concern about anti-Muslim kind of prejudice in the Conservative Party. Saida Warsi is not anywhere near what should be done by a member of the House of Peers or as a parliamentarian or a public figure with a platform. She does, of course, speak against racism, which is what I said was the case with Barney Grant. I mean, he did speak against racism, but Saida Warsi, despite the fact that she does feature from time to time and quite often as speaking against racism and against anti-Muslim prejudice, which she corruptly and ignorantly and idiotically describes as Islamophobia. Islamophobia, the word Islamophobia itself implies that Islam correctly deserves to be feared, that people who are not Muslims need to be afraid of Islam, whereas the word Islam means peace. So there is ignorance on the part of somebody who has got the platforms at the ready in the media, mainstream media. But she is ignorant. So therefore she can do damage rather than help the cause of opposing racism and opposing anti-Muslim hatred and prejudice. We have got other things to consider. The Guardian is saying on the front page today, Tuesday, the 12th of January 2021, police defy ministers as clamor grows for new COVID restrictions, that is the lockdown and other restrictions. That shows that there is a problem between the police and the government. And the key reason for this problem is the government's own role as insincere and corrupt and contemptuous of the safety needs of the people exposed to the pandemic virus. And we have been discussing this every day about the newspapers. And the Guardian is partly responsible as one of the Fleet Street titles for the lack of preparedness and the lack of rigor and the lack of fact and the truth and the truthful reporting that is needed by the society, by the people who buy and read and rely on or refer to the Guardian and other outlets. For example, they are not publishing the facts of where the virus is, at what rate. And if they don't publish that, then the people in those areas or people in every area are not able to see what they can do in terms of the movement and in terms of the activities that are not restricted, that are not covered by limitations imposed by the lockdown. And also they cannot take precautionary steps as they could do with the full information as to the actual numbers and the rates in their particular areas. And this has been the case. We have been saying this in every comment that we have made about the role of Fleet Street papers in suppressing the facts that are known to the government, known to the laboratories, known to the hospitals and the so-called experts as to the conduct of this virus. And they're not saying A to Z, which is the expression we have been using. The A to Z of the behavior of the virus. So the kind of the propaganda blitz that the Fleet Street newspapers are part of for vaccination That is the kind of thing that will be used by Johnson if he calls a snap election, which is what Politonby's piece yesterday published between 1600 and 1700 hours on Monday, 11th of January 2021 was about. So the propaganda bleats about vaccine, whatever the rate of the vaccine and whatever the actual date when the vaccine will be covering whatever part of the population. That is what seems to be the actual motive, that he will be enjoying a kind of popularity based on the false propaganda that vaccine has been achieved, the vaccination has been achieved. Now, this is a false, completely false and typical untruth. They're saying that UK's biggest union, that is trade unions, Unison, elects first woman as general secretary. Now, what are they suggesting? She won't be changing the policy, and she won't be changing the racist, corrupt role that Unison plays and has played. Unison is the union that contains what used to be, contains amongst other smaller kind of unions that have been merged into it, what used to be called NALGO. And NALGO was the National Association of Local Government Officers, which was mainly made up of the employees of the councils, staff. Officers is a wrong and offensive kind of elevation of the employees to the status of officers. They are employees and most of them are corrupt and have always been corrupt. And the trade unions in this country, contrary to the collective bargaining and other positive things and honest aims and purposes, have been sheltering crooks in an organized way or organized ways. So all the trade unions in this country are corrupt and corruptly fronted. And this is not just confined to the fronters of these unions. Most of these unions have been supporters of the Labour Party. I say most because not all of them support the Labour Party, and that is nothing to do with their ideological or ethical or moral kind of purity. It is because of opportunistic reasons, which we can avoid or ignore for the time being in this part of the discussion. The unions have had undue influence over the political direction of the Labour Party. And they've done that by making significant donations of funds to the Labour Party, but also by the fact that many of these unions members have enjoyed the status of membership of the Labour Party simultaneously. And so therefore, in terms of numbers, in terms of organized blocks, they have had a disproportionately large numbers and greater influence in terms of numbers than ordinary members of the Labour Party have had from the so-called grassroots. So what we have said to Tanman Desi, the Slav MP, in tweets today cannot be said at length on the tweets because it takes too many tweets. We can say at length, at some length, on the broadcast and on the Facebook pages. Essentially, the Labour Party is as corrupt can be, and it has been corrupt right from the beginning. And the evidence is not lacking. The Labour Party does not campaign against racism. And Jeremy Corbyn's exposure to alleged anti-Semitism by his regime or his leadership actually shows that the Labour Party has not got a clue in terms of the leadership opposing racism. And after the ouster and replacement of Corbyn by the creep Keir Starmer, it is most unlikely that the Labour Party would be opposing racism in any way, any shape or form whatsoever, except by tokens and except by tokenistic, careeristic, timid references by the likes of Tanman Desi and others who are of the African or Asian origins. Tanman Desi is of Sikh origin, but he's been so far crafty in assuming that he can be posting critical things against racism without really addressing the racism all around Parliament and all around the parties. So what the Labour Party's racism shows is that society and people who are targeted by racism, denied by racism, and affected by racism, which is what all of society is affected adversely by racism, cannot rely on the Labour Party to end racism. This is actually being broadcast at 16:45 hours GMT, not 8:30 GMT, because that was the time that was for the part A. This is part B. So this is 16:45 GMT. And we shall check if we can correct this error. And this is actually part B. So we timed it at 1600 hours GMT, which is not the time when it actually started. It started a few minutes before 1600 hours, but it is approximately that time. And what is happening with the rest of this particular part is that we are going to talk about the contents of the daily Boris graph, which is said in part A is promoting Boris Johnson's image as a can-do and go-getting kind of vaccinator. And there is a cartoon by their cartoonist. And this is about, this is a very apt cartoon that actually is not following the agenda of the Boris graph. It's not condemning It's condemning Boris Johnson for his excursion into Stratford. The idiot decides to travel to the Olympic Park, which is a disgrace. Olympic 2012 park, and the site chosen for the 2012 Olympics, it has got disgraceful legacies. It was chosen as the venue because Ken Lying-Still Livingstone later confessed that he had lied about Stratford being the best site for the locating of the Olympic Games, the hosting of the Olympic Games, because if he hadn't lied, said Ken Lying-Still Livingstone, then Stratford or that part of London or East London would never get the change it needed, the environmental change, because the place was, the actual location of the park was a derelict area. And he said that billions of pounds needed to change that would never have been made available to that area. So he lied. That is a confession that Livingstone himself has made subsequent to the completion of the bidding process and the selection of the Stratford site based in the East London borough of Newham. Now, that is completely typical of Ken Lying-Still Livingstone. The reason we say he's lying still is evident in the facts of his lying still. And the fact that Ken Lying-Still Livingstone has been able to enjoy the platform that he has enjoyed in the Labour Party and in the so-called left of the Labour Party shows the bankruptcy and the poverty of ideas and poverty of values prevalent across the whole of the Labour Party and especially in the so-called left in the Labour Party and in British so-called politics. As I said, the occupation of the subcontinent for 190 years by the British imperialists didn't end because of the Labour Party in Britain. It ended for other factors, other reasons that made the continuous occupation by the Raj untenable, unacceptable. And we shall be talking more about that as we update our commentary on the series of comments made by Shashi Tharoor, who is an Indian politician who was also an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations for a number of years while he was the Indian diplomat, senior diplomat at the United Nations. He is a Congress party politician from south of India. And we shall be talking more about that in the context of the famine, the genocidal famine that was caused by Winston Churchill taking away the resources from India and plunging the Bengal under the regime of the Raj in early 1940s to a genocidal massacre. And the people died en masse. Millions of people died. And according to Shashi Tharoor, The British Empire caused the deaths and massacres and murders of 35 million plus people across the subcontinent. By subcontinent, of course, we refer to India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh of today. And what Shashi Tharoor has said needs to be said more and more and more, and needs to be updated by taking into account emerging facts and evidence that were not available or accessible even when Shashi Tharoor started his own inquiries and investigations. And we shall be asking why it is only one person, Shashi Tharoor, that has made any significant kind of contribution in publicly speaking and publicly raising the awareness, or trying to raise the awareness about the impact and the implication and the damage and the harm that the British Empire did to the subcontinent. And as we said, we shall be talking daily about the Indian press, in the same way that we are talking about the role of Fleet Street and diagnosing Fleet Street daily. We shall be talking about Indian papers daily. And we are doing this at the same time investigating the role being played by the so-called Bollywood and Tollywood and Indian cinema industry elsewhere in the country, in India. So far, we have studied about 100 currently available, currently accessible blockbusters, or films that are titled as blockbusters. And most of them are dubbed, and most of them are actually in South Indian languages. Essentially, we have gathered the theme, and the theme, we say in singular terms, this theme is a very simple one. It's done safely, that is to say, not challenging the British kind of past or the Indian political scenes or situations of the present. It is intentionally staying away from telling the truth about the corruption of the Indian political parties and Indian governments, corruption of the last 74 years since 1947, 74 calendar years since August 1947. And it is not examining the various other cultural influences that are rampant in the cultural influences left behind by the empire, not the universal influences that can be shared, but the imperialistic ones that are still there are not being examined. And the main format of the films that we have seen is very simple. It's like a factory of film scripts that has been set up, let's say, across India. And there is always a theme that is based around the individual landowners or big business owners or local influential persons abusing their positions. And more often than not, there is a kind of counter to that kind of politician or big business person. And that counter turns out to be the hero, action hero of the film. And the action hero's action and activities and challenges are then treated as the kind of certificates for him to appear attractive to the prettiest young woman around. And that's what the love interest is created around that. and it is more often than not a successful ending. The prettiest young woman falls in love with the action hero, and then she and he get married. But in between, before they get to the marriage, there is always a series of battles and fights in the street fights and lethal kind of martial arts type of fights, showing the action hero as the winner against sometimes 20, sometimes 10, sometimes 30 opponents who are equipped with swords and daggers and long knives and the rest of it. And the action hero overcomes all of that. And it is not explained how the action hero acquired such kind of Superman kind of skills or abilities. What world did they come from and where they got the training? And most of the films are now being shot outside of India. And the surrounding architecture and the environment and the kind of countryside, the trees, plants, plantations, and the sea, all of those show that they are being filmed on locations across Southeast, Far East, Malaysia, probably Singapore, probably Thailand, probably Hong Kong, and probably other places, and also across Western Europe. Now, this is not a comprehensive list, this is not an actual list, but it is based on the evidence, the images that are available. So the only examination of the Indian judiciary is apparently done on a local basis. The Supreme Court is not shown, and what amounts to the High Court is not also shown in the local area. It is a lower court more often than not, and there is no actual examination of the real role being played by the courts in India. And there is no examination of the media. What there is very kind of incomplete, and as featuring the television channel that victimized a Muslim, and the main owner was put behind bars, but there is no examination of the details of the population, the demography, and the denial of basic equal rights to the hundreds of millions of Dalit people, the so-called lower caste people, the operation of the Brahminist kind of regime, and why all these big landlords and big businesses appear to be in the positions of control and power that they are. And there is no depiction of the ordinary villagers except as witnesses and part players and observers, and as victims of mass shootings or mass rape or whatever. But these are not explained. And the mass rape is kind of treated in a film called Vala, in any way remotely resembling the activities of real life rapes and gang rapes and massacres and murders of the victims. And Kashmir is treated as a kind of subliminal kind of issue. It is in the background. It's done in a way that doesn't say anything against Muslims, but it says against Pakistan, but not explaining why there is this hostility between Pakistan and India, and why Pakistan is such a threat. It is there, but it is not examined. and no reference is made to the arms kind of proliferation of nuclear arms or conventional arms. And Kashmir is not actually shown as a society of human beings, and none of the issues is examined. And women are treated as objects, as objects, including the fact that often the action hero begins by slapping the action heroine, if you like, or the love interest. And there is no explanation as to why she has to be slapped. The woman doesn't slap the action hero as many times as the action hero slaps the woman. And so therefore the Indian industry, film industry, based on the ones that we have seen so far, and we have seen about 100 in the last kind of 2 months or so, is being operated on a very shallow and artificial basis, and it is a waste of resource, a waste of time, and waste of opportunities that could have been applied to running serious themes and serious examination of issues. Instead of running the routine kind of fights and action hero beating up the rest of them, they could actually examine the real life limitations that most people experience in dealing with attackers and violent deniers of their rights and occupiers of the rights, and the gang rapists, and how the police are really criminalized and are recruited as part of the criminals' gangs. They're shown as being compromised by bribery, but nothing else is actually examined and shown.